Lecture 1, Introduction to Irrationality. Welcome to the Science of Irrationality. This is a course that I taught for many years in college to an undergraduate audience, but it is actually a fairly unique course. There are courses on cognitive psychology, there are courses on critical thinking, but there are very few courses that are organized around the principle of irrationality, rationality and irrationality. I have revised the course and updated it for Now You Know Media, and it is, I hope, something that you will enjoy. So let's get started. First of all, we might begin by asking the simple question, what does it mean to be rational? Before we can know what it means to be irrational, we might want to ask this question. So it sounds like a good thing, whatever it is. It sounds like something we should want to be. It also sounds like it might involve thinking and reasoning and using our brains. So that's good. But what does it mean to be irrational? Well, before we answer that question or even try to answer that question, I'm going to give you a couple of examples, two scenarios that I want you to just listen to and see what you think you would do in that situation, how you would feel in that situation. We're going to refer back to these several times during the course, and they get at some of the issues that we're going to be talking about in the course. So the first one is the strawberry cheesecake example. Imagine that lately you've been paying much more attention to your health. You've been exercising regularly and watching your food consumption. You've lost some weight and you are really feeling good about yourself. Tonight you're out for dinner with friends and you've had a very nice meal and a couple of glasses of wine. You don't usually have dessert, but this is one of those places where they roll the dessert cart right up to the table. Your eyes land on a big piece of strawberry cheesecake that probably is chock full of calories. But you really love cheesecake, and you haven't had it in a very long time. Imagine yourself in that situation. How would you feel? What might you do? Okay, here's a different scenario. Imagine that you are checking your schedule for the upcoming week, and you see that you have a doctor's appointment for a minor outpatient surgical procedure on Friday. But for the first time, you notice that this particular Friday is the 13th day of the month. You're not really superstitious, but you're going under the knife on that day, and you think, maybe I should reschedule the appointment. So think about that. Put yourself in that situation. One of the things that, just as a hint to future topics, one of the things that these two scenarios are both supposed to engender in you is a sense of inner conflict or a sense that something is not quite right. And so just let those sit for now. We'll come back to them later, the cheesecake example and the Friday the 13th example. Okay, so let's return to the question of what it means to be rational before we get to irrational. Now, the word rational, in the sense that we use it, and irrational, are not really the terms that have been used over the years with respect to this topic. They're fairly modern terms. More likely, in earlier times, we talked about reason as a human capability, reason. And that goes back all the way to the Greeks, 4th century BC. And so, for example, Plato placed a lot of stock in reason. Reason was an important human activity. And he also talked about the soul being divided into three parts. Appetites, which were what we would think of as drives like thirst and hunger, fatigue, and then spirit, which is what we would think of as emotions, That's the second part. And the last part was reason. And in Plato's view, reason ruled over the other two. So reason was superior and reined in our appetites and our spirit, our emotions. This is consistent with the sort of hierarchical view of the world that the Greeks had. Things were in a hierarchy, with humans, for example, higher than animals. Which leads us to Aristotle, Plato's student, who also talked about the soul, but in relation to the souls of plants, animals, and humans. He believed that plants had souls, animals had souls, and humans had souls, but he suggested that only humans have minds capable of reason. So here we have an early suggestion that humans are different. Humans have reason, and animals do not. And that is a theme that carries throughout the history of philosophy and also into psychology, modern psychology. So in our historical view of reason, our next stop is way into the future with René Descartes. Descartes was a 17th century French philosopher, and he is very important in the history of psychology. He really, although he was not a psychologist, he's a philosopher, he really advanced the view of psychology quite a bit because he, first of all, one of the things he introduced was the question of dualism, the idea that the body is different from the mind. The body is a physical thing capable of action, but the mind was something else that was apart from the body but controlled the body. And figuring out how that could be has been a problem for psychology for centuries. How could a non-physical thing control a physical thing? And so Descartes is responsible for, or is an example of the problem, the mind-body problem, which scientists would struggle with for years beyond. But more to our purposes, he had some things to say about reason. For example, he suggested that animals were primarily involved in mechanical movement. They did not have reason in the same way that we do, and so humans did have the same kind of mechanical movements that animals did. In fact, one of Descartes' great additions to the field of psychology was the idea of a reflex, which is a kind of bodily movement, but a mechanical one, an automatic one. And so when you touch a flame and you pull your hand away without having to say, oh, my hand is on a flame, maybe I should pull it away, you just do it. That's a reflex. And Descartes identified that as a kind of mechanical movement that he thought animals had, that animals did exclusively. But he recognized that humans did it as well. But humans have a mind that's separate from the body, according to Descartes. And here's the crucial part for us, that reason, the mind, according to Descartes, was responsible for all deliberate action. So if we chose to do something, then it was due to the mind. So that's Descartes, and as I say, he's an important figure who really did advance the science of psychology quite a bit. But just to give you the flavor of a different philosopher and their view of reason, let's turn now to Albert Camus, a 20th century existentialist philosopher, French. And you know, the existentialists were always a sort of a depressed group. They're worried about whether life had any meaning or not. And Camus, of course, was very much this way. And he referred to reason as ridiculous reason. In his famous piece, The Myth of Sisyphus, he writes a passage about that really sort of characterizes the ridiculousness in his mind of reason. I'm going to read you a short passage from that piece now. If I were a tree among trees, a cat among animals, this life would have meaning. Or rather, this problem would not arise. I should belong to this world. I should be this world to which I am now opposed by my whole consciousness and my whole insistence upon familiarity. This ridiculous reason is what sets me in opposition to all creation. I cannot cross it out with a stroke of the pen. So you probably remember the myth of Sisyphus is the case where has the famous image of the man rolling the stone up to the top of the mountain, only to let go and have the stone roll down again and return to the bottom and roll it up. And it is this symbol of sort of pointlessness in life. And the idea being that if there's any meaning to life at all, you have to figure it out. You're going to have to use reason to figure it out. And furthermore, in Camus' view, it was not a happy thing. It was a burden. That humans were compelled to try to figure out whether life had meaning, whether it was worth going on living or not, and that this was the ridiculous reason that he was talking about. Not a very cheery view of life, but you get the point that consciousness and the ability to reason has both great benefits, but it does mean, we must acknowledge that it means we can also contemplate things like our own death or the death of our loved ones. And so there are burdens to this great intelligence that we have as well. The question of the humanness of reason, the exclusively humanness of reason, is a common theme in the history of philosophy. And I should just, to give animals their due, non-human animals their due, I think it's worth mentioning that non-human species are capable of more than we have given them credit for in the past. Nothing approaching human language and intellect, of course. We have built cities, great technologies, done wonderful things that no other species has done. But parrots, for example, are capable of considerable language ability. We know chimps and other primates can be taught to use language, sign language, and then will go on to use it independently. And it's also the case that primates can be taught at a computer to do counting tasks, to do simple mathematical tasks, and even in the wild, primates use tools independently. Famously, they will take a stick, strip the leaves off of it, dip it into an anthill to try to pull ants out of it. That's considered to be tool use and something that is a sign of higher intelligence, to be able to recognize that an object could be fashioned into a tool. Classic view of intelligence. So I think the animals deserve a little bit more credit than they've been given in the past, but it is true that human reason is superior and is something fairly unique to us. Okay, I want to pause now on the philosophy part of the story and move on to some other views of reason and rationality. And where we really hit the sort of modern view of the term rationality is when we introduce the economic view, which is presented by or is characterized primarily by Adam Smith, the economist Adam Smith, who was a Scottish economist and philosopher. And he's responsible for the idea that all of our economic decisions are rational, that they are self-interested, that we always choose in a way that benefits us personally. And the interesting part is that view was standard view within economics for many years, and only in recent decades has it been shown, primarily by psychologists, that view is wrong in many instances. And so we'll get into that in much greater depth later in the course. But it is true that the standard view, and one that we'll use as a yardstick, is, does this action help me meet my goals? Is it in my self-interest? To do otherwise would be irrational. And we'll also look at, since this is a course on irrationality, we'll talk about the ways and look at the ways how individuals don't act as they should according to that model. Before we get much further into this, I want to point out that there are two versions of rationality, two categories of rationality, and these categories will actually divide the class somewhat in half. And so at the beginning of the class, we'll be talking primarily about epistemic rationality. Now, that word epistemic may be a confusion. The word stems from the word epistemology. And epistemology is a subsection of philosophy that deals with knowledge, how we acquire knowledge, whether various ways of acquiring knowledge are good or not, and so on. So how we deal with information and knowledge. And so epistemic rationality is about whether our knowledge is good knowledge or not. And what do we mean by good knowledge? Well, our understandings of the world should describe the world accurately. And our beliefs that we hold should also be based on a good and accurate description of the world. So epistemic rationality has to do with things like logical thinking and cognitive psychology. We will be talking in this class a lot about how to be logical, and also how sometimes our methods of thinking, our cognitions, go astray and are not logical when they should be. So that's epistemic rationality. And it also, finally, we need to recognize that having good beliefs, having good ideas about the world is a question also of evidence. So when we look at evidence, it should be sound evidence. We should value evidence. We should not dismiss it. And so good epistemic rationality involves all those things. It involves accurate descriptions of the world, seeking evidence, valuing evidence, and logical thinking. So that's one part. The second part of the course, and the second aspect of rationality that people in this field agree upon, is something called instrumental rationality. And that is the question of what you do with the information you have. So it is possible to be epistemically in the good place, to have solid beliefs, to have a good description of the world, to understand what is the right thing to do in a certain circumstance, but then you might do the wrong thing anyway. And that is called instrumental irrationality. If you're going to be rational, you need to do it in both ways. You have to have good beliefs, but you also have to have the willpower or whatever it takes to do the right thing with those beliefs. And this part of rationality does have to do much more with that economic theory view. Economics is often about transactions, and so this is where things can break down also. You could have a good view of the world and understand the world well, but still act in a way that isn't rational. And so the course will be looking at both those kinds. We will spend a fair amount of time on the development of good beliefs and epistemic rationality. We'll also spend a fair amount of time on things that cause us to act irrationally and instrumental irrationality. So we can go back now and consider the two scenarios just for a moment. We're going to come back to them many times throughout the course, but let's just go back and think about those two scenarios, the cheesecake and the Friday the 13th that I mentioned to you at the beginning of this session. So in the cheesecake case, if you put yourself in the position of that person at the restaurant, it's probably true that their reason says maybe not. I should say no. And if they have an accurate view of the world and they still want to maintain their program of good health and weight loss, the reason would tell them that they shouldn't. But instinct or something or desire may still pull them. So this is a case where there might in fact be a conflict between epistemic rationality and instrumental. They may know what the right thing to do is, but they may do the wrong thing anyway. In the Friday the 13th case, the same kind of conflict can result. A person might very well know that, it's silly. Friday the 13th is not an unlucky day. There's no evidence of that. It's not consistent with reason and what we think we should know. And yet they might feel a tug and might want to change the appointment. So that's a reasonable thing, a human instinct, and it does represent the same kind of conflict. So these two scenarios provide an introduction to some of the issues that we will be dealing with in the course, and as I said, we'll come back to them again, and we'll consider them in a number of different ways. So what I want to tell you about the course that lies ahead is that we will be discussing all these views of rationality and irrationality and many others. But it's not just a course in theory. Some of the examples that I use will be relatively trivial ones, like the ones that I presented just now. But there are going to be some issues of rationality that have very serious consequences for individuals and very serious consequences for society as a whole. So I hope that you find the course to be useful in a number of ways and entertaining as we go forward.